October 1st, 1946, Nuremberg, Germany. In the courtroom of the International Tribunal, justice sought to close one of the darkest chapters in modern history. Among the condemned, listening to their sentence, was Alfred Jodl, Chief of Staff of the Wehrmacht during the Second World War, a man whose name would remain linked to the most atrocious crimes of the Nazi regime. His end would be as merciless as the orders he himself had signed. Alfred Jodl was born on May 10, 1892, in Würzburg, a quiet German town surrounded by hills and vineyards. His childhood was spent in the shadow of a strict military father and a distant mother, an environment that shaped in Jodl an obsessive sense of discipline and obedience. From a young age, he showed exceptional intellectual abilities, and his path seemed clear: the army. At 19, he entered the military academy, beginning a career that would take him to the highest ranks of German military power. During the First World War, Jodl served on the Western Front. The brutality of the war and Germany's defeat in 1918 left him with a deep resentment, a feeling of humiliation that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The Weimar Republic and its political crises only strengthened Jodl's need for absolute order, a discipline that he would later find embodied in Nazism. After the war, he continued his training in the German army, specializing in tactics and strategy. His rise was steady thanks to his analytical mind, his skill in organizing military operations, and his absolute loyalty to the chain of command. By 1933, when Hitler came to power, Jodl was already integrated into the Wehrmacht's high command structure. He was not an ideologue, nor was he obsessed with politics, but he shared the belief in German supremacy and in blind obedience to the Führer. When the Second World War broke out in September 1939, Jodl played a crucial role in planning the invasion of Poland. As Chief of Staff, he was fully aware that the operations included assassinations, reprisals, and the systematic elimination of Polish civilian and military leaders. His knowledge was not theoretical. He signed orders and approved plans that condemned thousands of people to death, all under the guise of military legality. Throughout the war, Alfred Jodl became one of the principal architects of the Nazi campaigns. He signed orders that violated international law, including the execution of Soviet prisoners of war and the repression of resistance in occupied territories. Jodl's orders were not only carried out, they were sent with precision, accompanied by instructions to ensure no soldier was prosecuted for their fulfillment. Every one of his signatures expanded the reach of terror, and his reputation among senior officers reflected a cold and calculating respect. He was feared for his ability to organize and plan, but also despised for his servility towards Hitler. Jodl was never a man of visible emotions. His loyalty to the Führer was absolute, and he often seemed detached from the human reality of his decisions. While millions of people suffered and died, he remained in his office, reviewing maps, calculating troop movements, and signing orders that ensured the continuity of the extermination. The efficiency with which he operated concealed a moral indifference that made him as dangerous as any frontline commander. When the tide of the war turned and Germany began to lose territory, Jodl remained steadfast in his obedience. He participated in planning the defense of the Reich and coordinating desperate strategic movements, aware that defeat was inevitable. In April 1945, he signed the unconditional surrender of German forces to the Allies, an act that sealed his fate and delivered him to international justice. After his capture, Jodl was taken to Nuremberg, along with other high-ranking Reich officials. In court, he faced charges of crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The prosecutors presented irrefutable evidence, orders signed in his own hand, correspondence demonstrating his knowledge of systematic assassinations and the destruction of entire villages. as well as testimony from subordinate officers and concentration camp survivors. Jodl adopted a surprisingly cold attitude during the trial. He admitted that many orders were illegal, but presented himself as a subordinate merely fulfilling his military duty. He tried to distance himself from moral responsibility, insisting that obedience was the basis of the military structure and that his loyalty to the Führer was above any personal judgment. However, the judges rejected this defense. The magnitude of his crimes was such that blind obedience could not be an excuse. His role was considered active, conscious, and essential to the execution of genocidal and repressive plans. The testimonies against him were terrifying. Survivors described how his orders enabled the mass execution of Soviet prisoners of war, the destruction of villages, and the brutal repression of resistance in France, Norway, and the Balkans. Every document presented reinforced the image of a meticulous, cold, and ruthless man whose view of war was devoid of any humanity. The evidence left no room for doubt. Alfred Jodl was guilty. The final verdict was delivered on October 1st, 1946, guilty on all counts. The sentence, death by hanging. It was decided that his execution would be a public act of justice, though contained within Nuremberg prison, to send a message about the surrender of absolute evil. There would be no military ceremony or decorations. There would be no compassion. Only the judgment of history and the law. The man in charge of the execution was Master Sergeant John C. Woods, whose method had earned a reputation for being cruelly ineffective. Woods did not seek speed or mercy. His technique ensured the victim suffered for minutes, a reflection of the horrors inflicted by those he condemned. The gallows were prepared carefully, with a deliberately narrow trap door and a drop calculated to prolong Jodl's agony. Early on the morning of October 16th, Alfred Jodl was escorted into the execution chamber. He walked with the rigid bearing of a military man, but his steps were slow and measured, aware that the end was inevitable. His eyes scanned the room, observing the witnesses and guards, showing neither fear nor arrogance. As he climbed the steps to the gallows, a mixture of resignation and contained tension was palpable. Sergeant Woods placed the rope around his neck and checked the mechanism. The trapdoor opened, and Jodl fell. The rope did not break his neck. He immediately began to convulse, his legs thrashing violently and his torso arching in spasms. His eyes widened in horror, reflecting the extreme discomfort and lack of air enveloping him. For more than 25 minutes, Alfred Jodl struggled to breathe, a grotesque spectacle that resonated with the horrors he himself had authorized during the war. Witnesses described an anguished gurgling escaping his throat, each spasm accompanied by violent movements that shook those observing. There was no intervention to shorten the suffering. The intention was clear: for justice to show, in the crudest way possible, the consequence of deliberate evil. Jodl's agony was a mirror of the desperation that millions of people had felt under his orders. Finally, at 1:48 in the morning, Alfred Jodl stopped moving. His body was removed from the gallows and taken to the morgue, where it would be cremated. His ashes were scattered in the Isar River, ensuring that no memorial or place of tribute remained for one of the architects of the Nazi terror. There were no funerals or laments, only the memory of a man who lived among maps, orders, and strategies, and who died hanged, reduced to a body trembling from prolonged asphyxiation. Alfred Jodl died exactly as he had lived, subordinate to an evil leader, efficient in organizing death, alien to compassion, and devoid of genuine remorse. His final agony reflected, in a brutal and literal way, the suffering that millions had endured because of his decisions. It was a symbolic closure to a life that had been dedicated to blind obedience and the systematic execution of evil. Later historians analyzed Jodl's trial and execution as an example of individual responsibility in the chain of command. His death was more than a punishment. It was a reminder that even those who believe they are protected by the military structure and absolute obedience cannot escape the consequences of their actions. The gallows, the agony, and the cremation symbolized the definitive defeat of the man who had established himself as an architect of war and death. Alfred Jodl, 54 years old, ended his existence hanged, convulsing for 25 minutes, a victim of a mechanism designed to prolong his suffering. There was no compassion or ceremony. Justice had decreed that his end be as implacable and methodical as the crimes he had organized, transforming his death into an indelible lesson of human history. But this is part of our world history. If you liked the information, we invite you to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell to see more content like this. Give us a like and comment on what you want our next video to be. See you soon.